Good evening. We're live on YouTube. I'm Faye. Thank you for joining us. We have another very interesting conversation lined up for you today. So for our viewers who are just joining in, we're going to give you a minute to join in. Remember that you can support us using the super chat option that's right below the chat window. Every evening at 8 o'clock, we come in and we do a conversation about issues that are important, issues you should know about. Today's conversation is about an issue that affects us all. Just to give you a brief of what we're talking about, the government of India has decided in a recent announcement to open up commercial coal mining to the private sector and auction 41 mines. Now, of these 41 coal mines or coal blocks, 11 are in Madhya Pradesh, 9 in Chattisgarh, 9 each in Chattisgarh, Odisha, and Jharkhand, and 3 in Maharashtra. Interestingly, state governments have written back saying that they don't endorse this idea. Specifically, Maharashtra has noted that the mines that are in tiger reserves, and they are not, big fans of mining in tiger reserves. Critics have come out very strongly against the government's decision to auction, coal mines in what is dense forest areas, including, former Environment Minister Jairam Ramesh, who said that the government's decision to allow coal mining in no-go areas will be a triple disaster, as mining and the transportation of coal will impose a heavy environmental cost. It will lead to loss of dense forest cover and adversely affect public health due to air pollution associated with coal mining. Now, with regards to this story, in a report that the Hindustan Times just put out as well, several of these 41 coal mines, like I told you, are in biodiversity-rich forest areas. In fact, the interesting part or the worrying part about this is that some of these mines that are now being put up for auction don't have the required forest clearance that one would need in order to do any sort of construction or activity inside a forest, and they're inside protected forests. So, for example, in Chattisgarh, the Mandapur North mine in Chattisgarh is a total area of 21 square kilometers, out of which 19 square kilometers is clearly forest area. And the area is the drainage of several streams of the Hasadeo River, which is also a problem, and it doesn't have the forest and environment clearance that is needed yet. And so there are several other problems as well. Kanchi Kohli, who is the legal researcher at the Center for Policy Research, has been quoted by the Hindustan Times saying that with no end-use and pricing restrictions, I want to remind you that the government has not put out clear end-use for the coal that comes out of these mines. She says the government is giving up its responsibility of safeguarding public interest, protecting environment, and upholding the prevailing constitutional safeguards in the areas in question. So there are a few questions that we want to ask this evening with regard to this decision to auction 41 coal mines, some of which are in dense forest areas. So these are the questions that we're going to ask over the course of the next 1 hour. One, should the government be auctioning coal mines in dense forest areas, which have up till now been called no-go areas? Second, should environment impact studies and environment clearances be mandatory for each mine before it is auctioned? 3, should the tribal population of these areas be given a seat at the decision-making table when decisions are made about their land? And should the government be opening up coal at this point when power demand has slumped? These are the questions that we're asking this evening. And my panel to help us answer these questions are Alok Shukla, who is the convener of the Chattisgarh Bachao Andolan. He's an activist actually fighting on the ground, and he'll be able to bring in a very interesting point of view. We have Nitin, Sethi, who's a very senior journalist who's specifically written about these matters. Karthik Ganesan is a research fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. He's an expert on energy in India. And Ulka Kelkar is the director of climate program at World Resources Institute, India. I welcome all of you to this conversation, and I thank you very much for your time. So we're going to take this piece by piece. And for our audience, remember, you can leave us questions in the chat window through the course of this conversation. So my first question, obviously, should the government be auctioning coal mines in dense forest areas? I want to start with Nitin, Sethi, if I may. Nitin, good evening. What is your opinion on the auction of these 41 mines?
I think, Faye, there are two considerable points to take into account when you look at the environmental consequences of opening up these coal blocks. One is the local pollution challenge, which happens when you open up a dense forest patch to coal mining. The other is the larger global concern of climate change and whether we have to be trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emissions we have in our country over time. And while the country is doing well as far as the Paris Climate Agreement targets are there, this sets us up for a pathway that takes us away from being more ambitious to being less ambitious in the long run. Now, I think the trade-offs for any government have always existed to say that these coal blocks will always exist largely in forested or green areas. They might be dense, less dense, medium dense. These trade-offs is a challenge that every government tries. The perspective in which these blocks must be looked at is to say, did we need the power? Did we need the coal at this stage? Is it along the trajectory of the coal demand we'll have likely in the next 5 to 10 years, say up to 2030? And if we do not have a high coal demand surge expected, then why are we opening the coal blocks in the first place? And then why are we opening them in the dense forest places per se? Now, let me go back to the fact that in the UPA era, when I think Minister Jairam Ramesh was in charge in the Environment Ministry, he first created the concept of no-go forest areas, which were dense forest areas which had high biodiversity area. He initially listed out around, if I'm not mistaken, around 500 odd blocks saying these are in dense forest areas. These are the last you should go into. Under the pressure from the Prime Minister at that time, Manmohan Singh, and his small coterie of ministers, he diminished it down to roughly around 230. This is by 2014. We are now in 2020. From 2014 to 2020, that list of so-called no-go forest areas, or what's now called inviolate forest areas, has dwindled down to less than 5 coal blocks. Remember, we are going from 500 to 5 now. And each of these have been opened up on a piecemeal basis by constantly tweaking out the rules and changing the norms by which dense forests are recognized. I and my friends at the Reporters Collective had tracked this for the last 4 years. Each time a standard came up to say, well, at least 100 coal blocks need to be not opened up, the government would put pressure on the scientists to tweak the rules again and diminish the kind of standards that were set up. So science was kind of left orphaned while pressures from political and I would say the political economy, businesses were put up front. Now, in that context, considering that a 1-year slump is fair, that we have a slump in energy consumption, and it'll probably, as economy picks up, in a year or so, we'll reach a point where we are back to where we were 2 years ago. Maybe this is bad to do coal auctions at this point for 3 or 4 reasons. One, you're opening up coal blocks in dense forest areas. Two, how much coal you're going to consume is not reconciled with the amount of coal you are now putting out in the market. I don't have a problem with commercial mining per se. Three, this is just not making sense in terms of how far you want to go on an ambitious Paris Climate Accord in the long run. In the short run, you're meeting your target. So I think on these 3 or 4 accounts collectively, there are large questions to be asked about why the government is doing it now in a hasty manner, and perhaps later we come back to in a relatively very opaque manner, something that most people haven't paid attention to so far.
Very well said. In fact, I want to just open this up then to the rest of the panelists as well. Ulka, Kelkar, where do you stand on this matter? There's also the question of, the coal that we're using altogether, the responsibility, and I want to ask you this question as an average citizen, right? The coal under the ground, according to the rules in India, belong to the central government. But it's also the central government's responsibility and state government's responsibility to look after the forest, to look after the animals, to look after the biodiversity, because we've seen firsthand in the last 1 year what messing with wildlife and messing with the environment can lead to. Is there a problem of prioritizing the economy or the coal over the responsibility to the environment?
Thank you, Faye. That's a very good way of asking that question. I think this pandemic that we're in, this crisis that we're in, has shown us that health, environment, and economy, we can't any longer think of them as three separate, disconnected buckets. They're all very closely linked. And this decision of, of these coal auctions is bad for the environment, as Nitin has pointed out. It's bad for health because, for example, the recent Government of India's own climate change assessment report has shown that heat waves are going to increase. And so the kinds of health impacts that we'll be subject to will increase as a result of burning fossil fuels. We also have evidence from our own country, from states like Kerala and Karnataka, of how more incursions into forest areas can expose us to more new kinds of pathogens, like the Kyasanur forest disease has shown, more contagious diseases. And the kind of permafrost melt that we're seeing in areas that were normally covered with snow is going to expose us to what are now being called as zombie viruses, diseases which have lain dormant for decades, maybe even centuries, and we have neither immunity nor any kind of cure for them. So the health impact is clearly very strong. But let's examine why the government took this decision. And it's clearly for the economic impact. And the hope is twofold. One, that we'll get foreign investment, and two, that we'll be able to create jobs. And on both of these accounts, we are, instead of going for sunrise industries, we are doubling down on a sunset industry and creating a stranded asset. Foreign investors are increasingly divesting from fossil fuels. I think the Japanese banks were the last ones to still be major investors in coal. And even those are facing immense pressure from their investors like pension funds. Other big investment banks and sovereign investment funds like those from Norway have already made major announcements of how they're pulling out of coal. And even the Japanese, who were the last ones, are increasingly making these announcements. So foreign investment is not something that we can really hope for. And let's look at what kind of jobs we hope to create. The kind of imagination is for those kinds of Coal India jobs, which will come with pensions, with CGHS health access, or with Kendriya Vidyalaya, education for your children. Those are not the kinds of jobs that are going to be created with these private sector auctions. You'll have the gig economy all over again, contractual jobs all over again. So definitely the benefits are not there and the costs are too high.
That's, that's an interesting way to put it, that while the rest of the world is actually dialing down fossil fuels, in India, we seem to be dialing up. And I know that Karthik, Ganesan, as a counterpoint of view, at least he's offered to play devil's advocate on this conversation. But before I come to Karthik, I do want to go to Alok ji, who is actually aware of what goes on the ground, because he's an activist who's actually fighting on the ground right now. Alok ji, हमारे साथ जुड़ने के लिए बहुत शुक्रिया. क्या आप बता सकते हैं अभी कि छत्तीसगढ़ बचाओ आंदोलन में आपकी ओपिनियन क्या है? ये जो कोल ऑक्शन होने वाली है, जो सरकार ने अभी तय की है कि कोल ऑक्शन करने वाली है सरकार, तो आपको क्या लगता है कि ये नहीं होनी चाहिए या इनकी रेगुलेशन थोड़ी सी सख्त करनी चाहिए, कैसी करनी चाहिए?
देखिए, ये कमर्शियल कोल माइनिंग की जो ब्लॉक इन्होंने नीलामी के लिए रखे हैं, इसका देश के कोयले की जरूरत से कोई लेना देना है नहीं. ये सिर्फ और सिर्फ चंद कॉर्पोरेट के मुनाफे के लिए लिया गया निर्णय है. कोल इंडिया के विजन 2030 ये कहता है कि 2030 तक के लिए जो कोल इंडिया की ऑपरेशनल माइंस हैं और ऑलरेडी अलॉटेड माइंस हैं, वो सफिशिएंट है कोल जरूरत को पूरा करने के लिए. तो ये कोल की कोई जरूरत नहीं थी नए कोल ब्लॉक की कि इनको किया जाए. प्रधानमंत्री ने अपने भाषण में 2 चीजों की बात कही कि ये निश्चित तौर पे एक्सपोर्ट के लिए है. तो निश्चित तौर पे ये एक्सपोर्ट की बात है कि कोयला निर्यात होगा, लेकिन बड़े पैमाने पे प्रदूषण, विस्थापन और प्राकृतिक आपदा का ये एक तरीके से आयात करने जैसी स्थिति है. और जैसे ही उन्होंने अपने भाषण में कहा कि हम पर्यावरण का ध्यान रखेंगे, लेकिन जब 41 कोयला खदानों की जो सूची आती है, उसमें हम देखते हैं कि 14 कोल ब्लॉक घने वन क्षेत्रों में, जिसमें से 5 कोल ब्लॉक हसदेव छत्तीसगढ़ के हसदेव इलाके में है. ये वो इलाका है जो पूरा का पूरा नोगो इलाका था 2009-10 में. और उसके बाद इस पूरे इलाके को आप देखेंगे तो ये बांगो बांध का कैचमेंट है, जिससे 4 लाख हेक्टेयर की सिंचाई होती है. घना वन इलाका है, जैव विविधता से परिपूर्ण इलाका है, और ये पूरा मानव एलिफेंट का जो है नेचुरल हैबिटेट का इलाका है। छत्तीसगढ़ के 16 जिले आज ह्यूमन एलिफेंट कॉन्फ्लिक्ट के गंभीर दुष्परिणाम को भुगत रहा है। तो क्या कमर्शियल माइनिंग के लिए, सिर्फ मुनाफे के लिए हसदेव जैसे जंगलों को उजाड़ने की कोशिश की जाएगी? अपने आप में बड़ा सवाल है। दूसरा महत्वपूर्ण यह है कि यदि आप कोयले की बात करते हैं, ये नीलामी प्रक्रिया को मैं मानता ही नहीं कि इन्होंने कहा कि बड़ा राजस्व आएगा। 2015 से लेके 2020 के बीच में जो नीलामी की प्रक्रिया अपनाई गई वो पूरी तरीके से फ्लॉप हुई है, क्योंकि नीलामी विफल हुई है। 80 कोल ब्लॉक नीलामी में रखे गए, जिसमें से मात्र 31 कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी की जा चुकी कर पाई है मोदी सरकार। उसमें भी 8 कोल ब्लॉक वापस कर दिए गए कंपनियों ने, क्योंकि वो चला नहीं पाए। 31 कोल ब्लॉक में से जो 8 कैंसिल होने के बाद जो 23 कोल ब्लॉक थे, सिर्फ 12 कोल ब्लॉक हैं जिनमें से उत्पादन हो रहा है। उसमें भी 10 कोल ब्लॉक बिफोर 2015 के थे। अलॉटमेंट रूट से नीलामी क्यों नहीं हो पाई, उसके पीछे महत्वपूर्ण कारण यह था कि आपने सारे कोल ब्लॉक अलॉटमेंट रूट से डाले, और एमडीओ के रास्ते बहुत सारे कॉर्पोरेट को आसानी से पिछले दरवाजे से कोल ब्लॉक हासिल हो पाए। एक महत्वपूर्ण इसमें सवाल यह कि जो 80 कोल ब्लॉक आपने 2015 से लेकर 2020 के बीच में ऑक्शन और अलॉटमेंट रूट से आपने शुरू किए हैं, वो कोल ब्लॉक में से मुश्किल से जो है आप 15-16 कोल ब्लॉक को चालू कर पाए हैं। तो सवाल ये कि जो पिछले 5 सालों में आप कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी और आपने आवंटन रूट से दिए हैं, वही कोल ब्लॉक आप आज चालू नहीं कर पाए हैं, तो फिर ये नए कोल ब्लॉक की कोई आवश्यकता नहीं थी। अब एक महत्वपूर्ण जो इसमें देखने की
आलोक जी आपसे एक सवाल पूछना है। मैं अभी हिंदुस्तान टाइम्स की एक आर्टिकल पढ़ रही हूँ जो जून 18 की आर्टिकल है, जिसमें हमारी वित्त मंत्री, हमारी होम मिनिस्टर अमित शाह जो है, उन्होंने कहा है कि ये कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी से 2,80,000 ऐसी नौकरियां क्रिएट किया जाएगा, और रेवेन्यू विंडफॉल की गवर्नमेंट को बहुत पैसे आएंगे, तरक्की होगी इससे। तो आप नहीं मानते कि छत्तीसगढ़ में तरक्की ऐसी इस तरह की तरक्की होनी चाहिए?
देखिए, विनाश के आधार पे तरक्की नहीं हो सकती, और छत्तीसगढ़ पहले से ही देश का 21% कोयले का उत्पादन कर रहा है। क्या हम अपने सारे जंगलों को खत्म करके, आदिवासियों को विस्थापित करके, किसानों के खेत का पानी छीन के हम उत्पादन करेंगे? अपने आप में बड़ा सवाल है। जो राजस्व की बात कही, पुराने आंकड़े हम देख लें, मोदी जी ने उस समय कहा था कि बड़ा राजस्व कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी से आएगा। उन्होंने कहा था कि 2 लाख करोड़ 2.5 लाख करोड़ आएगा। सच्चाई ये है कि 2-5 सालों में मात्र 5,500 करोड़ रुपए जो है वो रेवेन्यू कोल ब्लॉक से आया है। तो सब ये जो और नीलामी की जो प्रक्रिया ये कहलाए, देखिए ये नीलामी है ही नहीं, मैं इसको नीलामी नहीं मानता। ये कोल ब्लॉकों का एक तरीके से बंदर बांट है। वो इसीलिए क्योंकि मार्च में द मिनरल्स अमेंडमेंट एक्ट लाके इन्होंने पूरी नीलामी के लिए जो प्रतिस्पर्धा थी उसको खत्म कर दी। 4 बिडल की जगह आपने 2 बिडल कर दिए, अंतः उपयोग आपने खत्म कर दिया, और सवाल ये कि आपको उत्पादन करना है तब करिए, नहीं करना तो नहीं करिए। जब प्रतिस्पर्धा होगी तब मैक्सिमम राजस्व आएगा, प्रतिस्पर्धा यदि कम होगी तो राजस्व नहीं आने वाला है। तो ये नीलामी सिर्फ दिखाने की है के लिए है, एक तरीके से कोल ब्लॉकों का ये बंडल बाट है, ताकि बहुत न्यूनतम रेट पे, जो कहा गया कि आपदा को अवसर बदलने की कोशिश है, ये कॉर्पोरेट को आपदा को अवसर में बदलने की कोशिश है, कि कोल ब्लॉक को बहुत ही न्यूनतम दर पे आसानी से कंपनियों को उपलब्ध करवाने की कोशिश है।
और मुझे एक बात बताइए आलोक जी, बिफोर आई ब्रिंग इन द अदर गेस्ट, आपसे ये बात पूछनी है कि हमारे फॉरेस्ट में जो ट्राइबल लोग रहते हैं, जो इंडिजिनियस लोग रहते हैं, कि क्या आप मानते हैं कि उनसे भी, उनकी राय भी लेनी चाहिए, उनको भी ऐसे डिसीजन मेकिंग अथॉरिटी देनी चाहिए? आफ्टर ऑल फॉरेस्ट उनकी होती है।
देखिए, ये जो कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी की जो लिस्ट आई है, इसमें अधिकतर कोल ब्लॉक्स उन इलाके में हैं जो संविधान की 5वीं अनुसूचित इलाके में है। आप नीलामी आवंटन के बाद भी आप ना जमीन अधिग्रहण कर सकते हैं, ना ही वन स्वीकृति कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि ग्राम सभा का कंसेंट अनिवार्य है। जो जंगल जमीन है उनके साथ उनकी आजीविका, उनकी संस्कृति और अस्तित्व का जुड़ाव है, और संविधान उनको मान्यता देता है। हसदेव की 20 ग्राम सभाओं ने इन्हीं आधारों पे 5वीं अनुसूची, पैसा और वन अधिकार के अधिकारों के तहत ये कहा, 2015 में भी कहा था और अभी भी कहा कि हम नहीं चाहते कि कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी हो, क्योंकि हमारा ये संवैधानिक अधिकार है, हम जंगल जमीन नहीं देंगे। कल जब भूमि अधिग्रहण की बात आएगी, ग्राम सभा विरोध करेगी। वन स्वीकृति की बात आएगी, क्योंकि फॉरेस्ट राइट एक्ट कहता है कि बिना ग्राम सभा कंसेंट के वन भूमि का डायवर्जन नहीं हो सकता। तो जब हमसे पूछना ही है तो हम आपको पहले ही कह रहे हैं आप क्यों ये कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी कर रहे हैं। तो सवाल यह है कि ग्राम सभाओं के संवैधानिक अधिकारों को दरकिनार करके ये नीलामी की कोशिश की जा रही है, जो अपने आप में बहुत ही दुखद है।
जी, थैंक यू वेरी मच। और मैं आपके पास ये और 3-4 सवाल है मेरे पास, मैं आपके पास आ जाऊंगी इसके बाद, but first let me just bring in our other guest as well. And here's the thing, I want to genuinely ask this of Karthik, Ganesan. Karthik, there was an unfortunate, heartbreaking incident in Kerala where an elephant was killed because she ate a boogie-trapped pineapple. And the central government, along with everybody else in the country, got very upset that how did this elephant die, and we will investigate and we will, make sure that such a thing doesn't happen again, which was highly appreciated. But here you have the same government auctioning out coal mines in the middle of an elephant reserve, where the state government of Chattisgarh has come back and saying, this is an elephant reserve, please don't touch it. The Maharashtra government has come back and said, this is a tiger reserve, please don't touch it. So there is a grave level of hypocrisy when it comes to actually caring for wildlife in India, because we're constantly encroaching on their land, we're constantly encroaching on forests, we're constantly creating man versus wild situations where animals get hurt invariably. I want to understand from you, and I'll come back to what the motive could possibly be of the government, but I first want to understand from you, how do you assess the government's commitment to wildlife, given what we know right now?
I mean, unfortunately, I'm not the best place to actually comment on this issue. I mean, as much as I'm a citizen who basically loves the environment because, it helps us sustain, right? So the quick thing that I will say on this matter is that, certainly I think the due process has not been followed. And, in classic terms, at least what we learn, in our academic training is that, there has to be like a simple cost benefit analysis that has to be done of where will this, take us.
Okay,
right?
so let me rephrase the question for an energy expert there.
Sure.
Our first guest, Nitin, said very clearly that unfortunately, the richest coal will always be under the dense forests or under the green areas of the country, and that's a tough choice that always needs to be made. Do you believe in the case of these 41 coal blocks, that a tough choice has been made, or has the easy low-hanging fruit been plucked at?
So first thing I'll say is this. I think as much as the decision to auction has happened, right? It's not played out yet at all. So in terms of who will actually come and bid for it, and what is the kind of revenue that will be got, and whether mining will eventually happen in these areas, none of it is played out. So what has happened is definitely not the most positive of signs. So I don't think it's a given that we're going to see 200 million tons of coal being extracted from these areas in 2026. So first of all, I just like to set that there, right? That said, I don't think this is the most prudent way of going about it. If you look at the CEA's 2030 assessment for what India's demands will be like, right? What we see is that the coal-based electricity generation is about coal and lignite put together is about 30% higher than what it is today, right? Coal and lignite-based generation in India in 2030. Based on a very significant renewable energy ramp up as well. It's not a significant, it's not like an insignificant addition of renewable energy capacity, which means that given the, the exuberance that we have on RE, even that leaves us with a fair bit of expansion on coal-based energy coming in, which means that there is room for additional coal consumption. I know it's a very bitter pill to swallow, but that seems to be the reality, at least given the way the technology costs are today. Now, the question I think that needs to be asked is, we've been importing steadily, in the range of 120 to 140 million tons of thermal coal every year in the last, 4 or 5 years, right? And that's kind of been like the steady level, right? Some days Coal India does better, some days it does worse, and sometimes the demand slumps, and as a result, we manage with it. Now, at this level of import and the exposure that we have currently to, the forex exposure that we have, right, to importing all of this is not backbreaking. Right. So what we could have basically done is, I think, chosen some of those more opportune coal blocks, right, which do not, I think, fall in these no-go areas, for which there has been some level of environmental clearance provided through due process, and one that is not seen as a clear land grab. And from Mr. Shukla's comments, there clearly a lot of these are under the guise of that. So those can certainly be avoided. So given the requirements that we have, which is about 30% more coal, roughly, right? And we're also not seeing any increase in efficiency of electricity generation. Now, if that happens, automatically the amount of coal that you require is not going to scale up by that 30%. So it's going to come down significantly as well. So, and more importantly, as the opening point that I think either Nitin or Ulka mentioned, was that the rest of the world seems to be sort of shunning coal in the sense that demand is plateaued, renewable energy is kind of replacing coal, whereas India it's not quite replacing. So which means that the global prices for coal should be on a downward trajectory. Granted, that has not been the case in the last 3-4 years, even when coal has been on the slump for various reasons. But if there is that sort of monotonous decrease in coal prices, we only stand to gain by relying more on imports and preserving our domestic resources. So I think from that perspective, the investment decision and whether this is going to be cost effective in the long run certainly has to be done. It can't be on the pretext of providing 300,000 jobs. 300,000 jobs is nothing to justify kind of intrusion and incursion that we're going to make into these areas. And I think even the 300,000 jobs can be sort of argued against, given the factors that we see Coal India reporting in terms of the number of jobs that it has created for the 600-700 million tons of coal that it actually produces each year.
Karthik, also before we move on to other aspects of this conversation, I do want to ask you about there are two more things to just apart from just mining. The transport of the coal, from what we understand, also creates a great deal of environmental stress and pollution, especially on the route of the people who live on the route of that coal. We know even in Mumbai we had a problem of the fact that there was a pile in this middle of our city. The other problem of India sort of abandoning its clean coal concept and just going back to let's just do it the best way we can. If you would just take a moment to explain to our audience what that is and why that's a challenge.
Clean coal, you're referring to the coal washing requirements, you mean?
Yes.
Okay, so I think on the coal washing, this is probably going to be a little unpopular, but coal washing was a sham in the first place, right? Okay. In the sense that less than 15% of the coal that was being burnt in coal-fired power plants was probably being washed, right? Washery capacity was grossly underutilized. But the solution to that was not to outright say we don't need to wash it anymore. The solution to that was to ensure that you're addressing each of the barriers that was actually preventing cost-effective washing and from washery rejects and other materials to actually be used in even more polluting enterprises that are centered in the areas where the washing happens. So the main reason that we hear why why they did away with the washing was because they could not actually guarantee that the washery rejects would actually be sort of disposed of. Instead, they were being burnt in even more harmful processes without any care for emissions. And as a result, it's better that we basically send it to formal plants with all the ash and whatnot, where you can at least monitor them better. And in any case, there is a case for utilizing these ash in various industries and such. Flawed at many levels, but this is the argument. But that said, washing was not happening, so I don't think it has changed it will change materially what we're seeing in terms of overall movement of ash and particulate matter, right? It's not going to change drastically is my view, because it is not really happening in the first place. Okay, so I will say that one part. And on the transport itself, again, see the transparency associated with the data on this front, right, as to how much coal moves from where to where by by truck, by railways, is not exactly there. But that's it. I think the examples that we see from the number of years that it takes Indian Railways to lay as little as 40 kilometers of rail line in some of these really dense forests, right, and the delays that it actually means for the actual evacuation. So many minds have really not even seen the light of day. So to me, it's actually a silver lining that this process ultimately will not happen in the pace at which we want. So in 2026, we're probably not going to be, I mean, I know that's being very optimistic, but that's
so Karthik, I understand what you're saying. You're hoping or banking on some level that our own inefficiency will stand in the way of this ravaging of the forests. But my concern with that is when we rely on inefficiency, what we might see as inefficient over a period of 3 years might actually play out over a period of 15 years. And in the course of that period, the behavior gets normalized. because it was approved by a previous government, something, and then we wind up, with a Dibang Valley type situation where, you can blame it on the previous government and then just go ahead with it. You whittle it down over a period of, and I believe that this is important at this point when civil society and environmentalists come together and say no, because if we allow efficiency to play policeman here, it's a little weak for as an argument for me. Nitin, Sethi, I want to ask you this question. So also, Manoranjan Kishore has asked the question. He says, safety aspects in every mine is practically bad right now, in spite of it being done by the PSU. Will there be a further problem by private players? Now, I want to expand this question a little bit for you, Nitin, with this is a very weak auction in terms of the regulations that have been placed, right? Environment clearances are not done. There's no clarity on what this coal is going to be used for. Why we're taking it out of the ground and what the end use is for the company that's taking it out. Do you believe this causes extra safety concerns? And this should be something that worries citizens.
I would say it causes safety concerns. Mining labor in India has always suffered from lack of safety, whether it's CIL. And remember, CIL doesn't do much of its mining on its own. It actually subcontracts it to private players. So yes, the outsourcing of labor is a business that's gone on in Indian mining sector for a while now. It's not new. As Alok was mentioning, we also have backdoor entries through what is called an MDO contract to get private players to take over at very cheap prices coal blocks. But let me come back to the damage that perhaps coal blocks did at very large levels to the economy. Now, here is where I slightly disagree with Karthik and agree with you that depending and trusting upon inefficiency does actually not lead us to a better position. It actually leads us to a pretty horrible position. And let me try and spend 2 minutes explaining that. Now, if in the middle of a pandemic, a government of any nature, we've seen this in the previous one, you take this one in the last 5 years and you take this again. Any government which in haste and in a very non-transparent manner, and I'm saying this with assertiveness because I've read the documents concerned, wants to auction off coal that we don't know about without the adequate clearances, and you can look upon them as licenses. If you are not an environmentalist, let's say as a businessman, I looked upon them as 3 licenses: the forest license, the environment license, and the tribal license. Now, even if as a businessman, I am taking over a property on which I don't know whether those licenses will be given to me or not. Now, there are only 2 options available to me as a government. Either I am in my head dead sure I will break the law, I'll change the rules, whatever is required, and I'll make sure these guys get their licenses because they're paying me money. Or if I don't do that, I'm making sure this business is looking at a risk which cannot be factored into a normal business operation. Now, what this leads to, and this is where we come back to the big picture, what this leads to is a very corrupt political economy built on absolute discretion of the political class. Now, if you look at the tender document which is out for these coal blocks, it openly and rather, I'm quite amazed at the fragrant nature. It says this. It says at any point, for any reason, that the government will not and need not tell the bid participant, it can cancel the allocation at any point. It can reject a bid for any reason whatsoever at any point, even if you're technically capable, even if you're financially capable, even if you have the highest bid. Now, what it smells of is absolute political discretion to give it to whom you want, how you want, and when you want, in a non-transparent manner. And the reason I'm saying this is because the evidence that this has happened in the past 5 years, I remember Mr. Shukla also dug this out on his own, did a lot of investigations, so did others, and showed that the previous bidding itself that happened of a few auctioned off blocks, actually was a failed disaster. That's why we did not get any revenues out of it. And those, I can trust me, were less opaque than the bidding processes that we're getting into at this phase. They were much more open-ended. I remember Mr. Piyush Goyal trying to defend it. It went horribly wrong, but he had at least an iota pretense of transparency at that point. In these so-called auctions, and I use the word so-called with utter responsibility, there is not an iota of transparency in how this will happen.
Now, Nitin, sorry. explain to me, and I know that Mr. Shukla has also said it, that this is being done for the private benefit or profit of certain corporates. Explain to me how that would work.
Now, I won't go as far as Alok does. Alok's more brave than I am. I need to stick to
I did ask you for names.
Conservative facts. So I'll stick by even by conservative facts. Just look at the facts as I stack them up. And perhaps to average listener of yours, it will make sense, I hope. Now, what is a bidding process? A bidding process is when the market is really doing well, there is great demand. The country decides here is a very precious natural asset, but we have to use it. So we'll use it at the best price, hopefully, and we'll be able to somehow manage that the cost of electricity still remains low when we sell this costly coal. Now, we are selling it at a point when the coal market is in a slump. If you opened up a new coal market in India today and said everyone can sell and buy, you'll probably hit a slump patch that you've never hit in the last 5 years. Even perhaps at the time of demonetization, life was not as bad as it is today in terms of where the economy stands. Now you say that the bidding can be done by just 2 players in the game, and the third player will not know why they got rejected. Third, you are saying that the outgo that will come, the revenues that will be earned from these will be spread over a long time. What you call as an advance will be spread even over 3 years. So what you think is an advance coming from the auction of a mine will also be given over 3 years. Now, our previous experience shows with all the gobbledygook that this government has tried in the previous auctions, as Mr. Shukla was rightly pointing out, by 2019 end, out of the so-claimed 1.2 lakh crores, the government was only able to secure around 5,500 crores. I mean, if that is not a scam, I don't think the previous one is also. So we landed up after 2014 December order that cancelled coal blocks for allocation. We landed up in a regime. The previous regime was discretion outside law. What this government did was create a discretionary power by actually passing a law saying, I have all the powers to do whatever I want. Now, you can say that legally today it's fine. Legally, the government has covered over for what the Supreme Court tried to prevent. But the fact is, you are in an ethical moral frame. You are perhaps in a more perverse space than what UPA was when it did its allocations of coal.
Right. So let me then take the question to Alok. Alok ji, Nitin ji का कहना है कि आप उनसे ज़्यादा बहादुर हो.
लिखना उतना ही ज्यादा कठिन है आज के समय.
तो आपसे सवाल ये है कि आपको लगता है कि ये हमने एक बार ऑलरेडी देख लिया, जैसे नितिन ने अभी जिक्र की थी, यूपीए के टाइम पे कोल ऑक्शन की घोटाला हुई थी एक, क्या आपको लगता है कि ये कोल ऑक्शन जिसकी अनाउंसमेंट हुई अभी, ये भी एक घोटाला?
निश्चित तौर पे द मिनरल्स अमेंडमेंट एक्ट 2020 जो मार्च में जस्ट लॉकडाउन के पहले आया, दुखद रूप से उसकी चर्चा नहीं हो पाई. विपक्ष ने भी क्यों ध्यान नहीं दिया पता नहीं. जब उसके आप संशोधन को देखेंगे तो 3-4 महत्वपूर्ण संशोधन किए गए. पहला, जो नितिन जी ने कहा कि जो न्यूनतम बिडर है वो 4 से 2 ला दिए जाए. बिफोर की जब पहले की हम नीलामी देखेंगे तो हम देखेंगे कि कई नीलामी के जो चरण थे वो इसीलिए रद्द हुए क्योंकि जो न्यूनतम बोलीदार थे वो नहीं मिले. जो 4 न्यूनतम बोलीदार थे वो कोल ब्लॉक के नीलामी में नहीं थे, इसीलिए उनको उन राउंड को कैंसिल करना पड़ा. जो पहले नीलामी की जो दर थी, जो बेस प्राइस था वो पर टन के आधार पे था, उसको बदल के आपने टोटल रेवेन्यू का 4% कर दिया. कैसे कैलकुलेट होगा टोटल रेवेन्यू का पता नहीं. अब आपने प्रोस्पेक्टिंग कम माइनिंग लीज के प्रावधान के एक साथ आपने लेके आ गए. और सबसे महत्वपूर्ण ये कि आपको एक अंतः उपयोग तो है ही नहीं, और उसके अलावा कि आपको ये एक फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी है कि आपको जब चाहे माइनिंग करना है, नहीं करना है उत्पादन, वो एक उसकी एक जगह दी. तो आप जब एक सीक्वेंस देखते हैं कि आपने एक कानून में को संशोधन किया और उस संशोधन में इस तरीके से के नियम बना दिए ताकि प्रतिस्पर्धा जो है वो खत्म हो जाए, और प्रतिस्पर्धा खत्म करके कोविड संकट के बीच में जब सारी अर्थव्यवस्था एकदम ध्वस्त है, उस दरमियान आप कोविड संकट के पहले जब अर्थव्यवस्था शायद बेहतर थी, उस समय आप कोल ब्लॉक के नीलामी नहीं कर पाए सफलतम रूप से. क्यों? क्योंकि खरीदार नहीं मिले आपको. कोविड संकट के बीच में जब अर्थव्यवस्था की हालत खराब है, उस दरमियान आप कैसे अपेक्षा कर सकते हैं कि हमें मैक्सिमम राजस्व मिल जाएगा? उसके पीछे की कहानी यही है कि आपने रास्ता ऐसा तैयार किया है कि दिखाएंगे तो हम नीलामी, लेकिन एक तरीके से ये आवंटन है कि मन चाहे कंपनी को जो कोल ब्लॉक है उसको देने का एक रास्ता किया गया है। और एक नया कोल घोटाला है, हम बोलते हैं इसको कोलगेट 2 है, जो एमडीओ के रास्ते से शुरू हुआ है कि छत्तीसगढ़ के अंदर आपने नीलामी की जब आप डेटा देखेंगे तो सिर्फ ओनली 4 मिलियन टन पर एनुअल कैपेसिटी के आपने कोल ब्लॉक नीलाम किए हैं और 117 मिलियन टन पर एनुअल कैपेसिटी के आपने आवंटन रूट से दे दिए। और आश्चर्य होता है कि वो सारे आवंटन रूट के जो कोल ब्लॉक हैं उसमें से 75 मिलियन टन के कोल ब्लॉक सिर्फ एक ही कंपनी के पास पहुंच जाते हैं। तो जो कंपनी, अडानी कंपनी, जिसको नीलामी में सिर्फ एक कोल ब्लॉक हासिल हुआ हो, वो आवंटन के बाद एमडीओ के रास्ते 100 मिलियन टन के कोल ब्लॉक हासिल कर ले तो कोई कंपनी नीलामी में शामिल होने वाला नहीं है। तो ये जो कमर्शियल कोल ब्लॉक की नीलामी है, ये एक तरीके से एक बंदर बाट है, आसानी से कोल ब्लॉक को कुछ कंपनियों के हाथ में सौंपने की कोशिश है। और महत्वपूर्ण बात है कि जो व्यवसाय की बात है, ये कोल इंडिया को खत्म करने की बात है। ये कोल इंडिया को रिप्लेस करेंगी कुछ कंपनियां। हो सकता है आगे चल के कोल इंडिया का नाम किसी एक नई कॉर्पोरेट कंपनी के नाम कहलाने लगे। तो ये कोल इंडिया को भी खत्म करने की ये साजिश है।
ये एक और बात मुझे आपको बतानी चाहिए, मेरी ऑडियंस को बतानी चाहिए कि कोल इंडिया की सीएमडी की 2 दिन की पहले की बात है, उनका कहना है कि ये कमर्शियल माइनिंग विल नॉट हिट कोल इंडिया। और कोल इंडिया की जितने यूनियंस है उनकी स्ट्राइक की बात चल रही है अभी। तो there's an interesting impact on Coal India as well, and I'll take that question back to Karthik, Ganesan, because Coal India at the end of the day has been seen as a Navratan company in the government. Of all the government organizations that are possibly not going to bring the government any value, Coal India is one that has always done well. So will this hurt Coal India more than it will benefit anyone else? That's a question I'll take to Karthik. But first, I want to go to Ulka. Kelkar, Ulka ji, I want you to respond to what both Alok ji and Nitin ji have just said. The fact that this could be, even on cursory glance, room for a second coal gate. Let's not, let's err on the side of caution, like Nitin Sethi has advised us. Does this leave room for another massive problem?
I think the problem that this is creating is something that is even bigger. I would put it in bigger terms than the immediate political economy terms in which the other two panelists have framed it. I mean, let's not forget that this coronavirus crisis will come and go, but India is a country that is at a severe risk of water shortage. And one of the points that none of the panelists have raised is that coal power plants use a lot of water, and there have been lots of shortages and shutdowns of power plants in the past. I think there are just only a handful of power plants in our country which use, say, ocean water or recycled water. Most of them use fresh water, and we don't have this water. This is water that we're taking away from our farmers, from our cities. So what we are doing is a very myopic kind of solution and creating a much larger crisis lies behind it. The second reason why this is a big governance problem is that you're not actually, one of your 3 questions was, which people should be consulted, should the tribals be consulted, and so on. Even there, you have to be very careful because, for example, there have been cases from Assam which have shown that people whose lands are going to be taken over are consulted. They do get a chance. They have no choice. This is the best that they can do with their land, maybe, so then they decide to sell it or lease it. But there is a twist in the story. When there is compensatory afforestation for projects such as this, where are those plantations going to be planted? Then we suddenly find out that there are other villages which were not even informed or consulted, whose pastoral grazing community lands are going to be taken over and fenced off for these plantations. So the idea of consultation has to be taken much more seriously and be much more transparent. And the final point is, because you asked me, is this creating a bigger problem? Yes, because if you look at what other countries have done in the past when there was a crisis, let's look back just a few years ago to the 2008-2009 recession, which was the biggest that the world had seen so far in our lifetimes. And the countries that did well were the countries that took green measures, not the typical path, but the off the beaten path. So Korea, for example, put 70% of its stimulus money into green measures. And compared to the rest of the Western world, South Korea was the first to bounce back from that recession. China emerged from that recession as a solar power superpower. So the question for India is, do we want to sort of just go on investing in these sunset industries and this no-go kind of solution? Or is there something we can do which will help us to come out of this crisis in a more positive way?
Ulka, very quick question before I go back. And I know Nitin had a point, he raised his hand, but question to you. Has the Environment Ministry and portions of the government made a mischievous use of the COVID lockdown to pass a lot of environment unfriendly decisions?
Well, I think we are fortunate to be living in a country like India, which is fundamentally democratic, right? Where fundamentally people can still ask questions. The media, people like yourselves can ask questions.
And
the answers we get is debatable.
And lose jobs.
So I think for sure, if you see what is happening in the United States, the same thing is happening with Donald Trump rolling back a number of environmental laws as well. The pandemic is just I would say in the normal course of things, a very short spell of time, and perhaps physical consultations cannot happen when local governments are extremely preoccupied with firefighting with the pandemic. But I think the larger trend towards greater vigilance of people, of citizens, of the media has to continue. And finally, the pressure is going to come from two sources. One, from business. You'll find that shareholders are putting pressure on investors, on businesses to divest from dirty sources of power, from fast fashion, you name it. Look at any industry and there is pressure on business to become cleaner. And the second is from the youth of today. I think, if you see younger people, I think they are not afraid of raising the kinds of questions and demanding that the solutions that are being invested in right now are not just short-term solutions, but long-term solutions which will last well into their lifetimes. So I think both of these issues sort of show that we are finally on a kind of trajectory which is going towards cleaner environment rather than.
All right, Nitin. So while Alok is braver than you, Ulka is more optimistic than I am. She's more of an idealist and an optimist than I am, because while young people in India are protesting for the environment, they're also getting. If you remember what happened at RA Colony in Mumbai, they just got loaded into police vans and taken into lockup while the trees were chopped mercilessly through the night. So I don't know how much of a dent we're really making in terms of young people protesting. But Nitin, I saw your hand go up on the matter of tribal consultation and consulting the indigenous people of the forest. What did you have to add?
2-3 things. To one, respond to Ulka and your concerns about her optimism. I think we're hitting a shit show. And let's not be, while we all need to be optimistic, let's not be looking away from the reality. We didn't need a COVID for this government to act with brazenness that we didn't see in the previous regime. Not that the previous regime was any great about environment. It pretty much went down the same route. But this government's done it with more brazenness. People like you and I who've asked more questions have had to suffer more than we did in previous regimes. Third, I don't lay hope in the urban elite children, even if they're very sensitive towards the environment. My hope lies actually in the very strong community centric work that is being done in the villages and the tribal areas. And I believe that is your best hope of having a relatively more balanced approach between environment and straightforward economic growth. Now, to come to that, if this government really intended to have a clean game played on the coal market, what you would do, and this I'm playing as the devil advocate from a clean businessman's perspective, I would say, here's a coal block. It needs 3 licenses: environment, forest, and tribal license. If you call the consent from the tribal community a license, I would say I will first go out and get these and secure them for you. If I've got all these 3, then I will put this on auction, because then there's a clear title that you can get over land. I will acquire the land, I will get you the licenses, and I say, here, look, all people have consented, the land is ready to be handed over, and then I'll auction it. I'll probably get a better price. Now, as a good businessman, if I don't want to play dirty, I'll come over and look at a plot of land and say, I don't know who owns this land. The government in its auction document says We don't know whether you will actually get the land or not. And if you don't get it, we are not to blame. This is actually said in so many words. Then the government says, we are not, actually by law, we can't guarantee you an environment clearance right now. I cannot even guarantee your forest clearance because this is a dense forest, and I'm quite committed, and I'm sure somebody like Mr. Shukla will go and file a case in Supreme Court, rightly so. So I can't guarantee you anything, yet I'm saying invest 500 crores in this piece of land. Now, the only way I will do this is because I'm clear I can do things that go behind the law and break the rules to get this when in place. And this is what we've seen repeatedly over past 2 decades, what is called a fait accompli, where the government first hands over a piece of land or a piece of property or an asset to a private party and then says, oops, we've already given it. Now all of you fall in line and please hand over your rights to this company. And unfortunately, in most of the cases, the Supreme Court has actually agreed with the government on this count. So there is actually a clear sighted example. I'm not against commercial mining per se. I don't mind if coal reaches the right place in the right market, but this is not a market. Here is a government controlled crony capitalistic system that you're setting in by law. And on top of it, you're doing this by overriding constitutionally guaranteed rights of the tribal communities. Now, again, this is not a law. These are constitutionally guaranteed rights. You know that the rule in a tender will be breaking the constitution, and yet you're willing to go ahead with it with brazenness. So I'm not very optimistic. I do believe this is a rather sad point in our environmental jurisprudence and governance in India. We've done bad earlier, but we're now reaching a point where it will be very difficult to step back from. But that said, and I'll use 1 more minute of yours, on the climate change front, I think we must segregate, and all your listeners must understand there are 2 different ball games altogether. Our global climate change targets, we are actually really much more progressive than most other countries, weirdly as it might sound. We are actually doing much better than others. But that is not the metric by which you will judge whether coal blocks should go or not. Even if we opened up these coal blocks, we will meet our Paris climate targets, which are set very low. And yet when they're set low, they're better than US and most other countries, relatively speaking. Now, our challenges are the fact that we are a poor country. Our challenges are the fact that the renewable industry has actually not picked up as well as people thought it will. It's going through a really bad phase, like coal was, maybe less than coal, but it's sliding into a bad spot. We will need coal in the coming years. Karthik is absolutely right. You cannot go away from coal in the next 15, 20 years as much as you might want. Yes. Therefore, the need to have absolute transparency in these processes is important. Here is a government which has actually said that the tendering and the records that are used for tendering, bidding, and allocation are not even going to be provided to citizens under RTI because these are secret things. You are selling a national asset secretively by putting a rule saying so much. So I'll end with that saying there are various challenges, and clearly by all those metrics, even if I was to side on the saying there is going to be a demand for coal, this is the worst possible way we could have gone for it.
Wow, very well said. And I'm going to, so Karthik, I actually have a list of questions for you that I've accumulated over the last couple of answers. So here goes. There's always been an argument specifically from government as well, saying it's a choice or a balance between development and environment. You can't really tip entirely on one side, and this is the balance that we're trying to hit. And a lot of people have criticized environmentalists as nuisance bleeding hearts who stand in the way of development. So I want to understand from you, first point, do you believe that balance is being struck here in this 41 coal mine auction? Secondly, a lot of my viewers have popped in to say that we should be looking at alternate sources of energy. But are these, is this particular auction, can it be offset by alternate sources of energy? Because how far away are we from being able to do that in India? And finally, the question of Coal India being sufficient for us up until now, but now we're bringing in these new companies. So, and I just want to read this out from a new Indian Express article that was published on the 17th of May that said that the decision to allow domestic mining firms like SL Mining, Sasagoa, JSW Steel, which is the Jindal, JSW Energy, Vedanta, Adani, and global giants like Rio Tinto, BHP, and Glencore. So that's quite a list. For an environmentalist, that's a list that will bring up some emotions. But I want to understand from you these few things. One, is alternate energy really an alternative in this particular case? Two, are we doing development versus environment as a balance? And these companies that are going to come in at this point, most likely, in your opinion, do you agree? What impact will it have on Coal India?
Maybe I'll go with the second question first, Faye, right? So whether this hinders the development of alternatives, absolutely not, right? I think that the role that renewable energy will play will continue to hold its course, staggering as Nitin might say it is, right? It will sort of continue to do what it does, because ultimately the coal-fired power plants that this coal is going to feed into, right? Many of them are already in place, and the plans for the 60 gigawatt is already there. Right, so that's not really changing renewable energy coming in a big way. That said, when we're talking about 20,000 crore worth of investment that this government is saying is going to come into, I think that was probably even the coal gasification. We haven't even gotten into this, and that was the coal gasification story, right? But whatever be the amount of investment, so I think what really needs to be thought out is whether, as I said, it's better to sort of have the exposure to imports and possibly the upside of lower cost imports, and not degenerate our environment within, and especially pristine areas which are home for biodiversity hotspots, right? So I think from that perspective, it's certainly a bad choice, right? So when the question that you asked was whether this is a trade-off between development and I think environment. I think in this case this is not the right trade-off, right? I think they need to definitely sort of rethink whether the scale of requirement that they want from these 41 blocks is justified, whether the alternatives that are available currently, whether it is within CIL blocks that are much more accessible, already explored significantly with all the clearances in place, and the imports are not good enough to cover for our needs, to also get a sense of where the rest of the tech is actually going, right? As much as coal mine does take a few years, as Nitin rightly said, probably the process that ought to be is that you take 3-4 years and figure out, hey, are you going to get the 3 clearances that you want for it? And then you at least make a process that is available through which, let's say, mining can happen in 3-4 years after that. Whereas right now you're putting them in a place where there's uncertainty for 3-4 years to whether you'll get it, and in any case the activity isn't going to start. So I think the ordering of the entire thing is probably off, and I think it's definitely sort of compromised in our environment more so than it's done anything for our development. I think it reeks of the thought that the best job that we can offer our rural population is basically that of a very, very bad coal mining job. Right? They haven't really put their thinking hats on to think about what can we actually do to promote other sunrise industries, right? That are locally relevant. We're not talking about something fancy in the middle of a forest. Obviously not possible, right? We're talking about development jobs that are, jobs that are actually relevant to the areas that we're in. And I think the third question that you actually had was on CIL and its future. I think that is also fairly secure, right? We've had this foreign participation being sort of drummed up in recent past as well, right? Where there were again threats of CIL strikes and everything else, but nothing really happened. Primarily because I think the only risk really that I see is that if everything is sort of being given through the back door, if through legal processes, all these big corporations overseas actually have signed on to all these anti-corruption practices and stuff like that, they should know that there is nothing really to be had here from the legal route. Right, because all of this is really circumspect. There are no clearances available. So I feel that foreign parties coming in is a big question mark. It's probably going to be the domestic parties that are going to benefit from this significantly. I don't see that much of technology coming in from overseas in this first place. And CIL itself, I think, is content with what it's actually doing. It is effectively a shrinking organization in terms of the base that it represents, employee base. It's relying excessively on contracting. Right. So I don't think there are any threats for CIL per se in this. They have their blocks that have been guaranteed. They will continue to chug away, trying to meet the 1,000 million tons target, which may end up never happening. And they will contribute in whatever way they can, because all of them are anyway, nominated in allotted fields. Yeah.
Right. So a quick question for Alok ji. Alok ji, मैंने जो initially पढ़ा था कि ये पूरे auctions में 11 ऐसी कोल माइंस मध्य प्रदेश में, 9 छत्तीसगढ़, 9 उड़ीसा, 9 झारखंड में और 3 महाराष्ट्र में ना, इन सारे राज्यों में से महाराष्ट्र और छत्तीसगढ़ ने मना किया है. They've written letters to the central government opposing some of these mines. But मध्य प्रदेश ने कुछ नहीं बोला है, उड़ीसा ने कुछ नहीं बोला है, झारखंड ने कुछ नहीं बोला अभी तक, जितनी मेरी जानकारी है. आपको क्या लगता है कि इन राज्यों की जनता को क्या करनी चाहिए अभी? How should they approach this problem? Should they in fact be a little more careful about what their state governments are deciding to do?
देखिए, किसी भी राज्य के कोल ब्लॉक हो, कोई भी व्यक्ति अपनी जमीन को बहुत आसानी से छोड़ने वाला नहीं है। सवाल ये है कि विरोध अभी है या विरोध बाद में हो, लेकिन इन कोल ब्लॉक के खिलाफ जमीनी संघर्ष होंगे, विरोध होंगे, चाहे वो उड़ीसा हो, चाहे वो मध्य प्रदेश हो। झारखंड सरकार ने विरोध किया है, उन्होंने पूरी नीलामी का उन्होंने ये सवाल नहीं उठाया, लेकिन उन्होंने कहा कि इस कोविड संकट के दरमियान नहीं होना चाहिए। लेकिन उनका एक झारखंड सरकार का जो महत्वपूर्ण बिंदु है, वो संघीय ढांचे पे हमले का सवाल है, क्योंकि इस पूरी प्रक्रिया में आप देखेंगे कि राज्य सरकारों के साथ कोई परामर्श नहीं किया गया, सारी प्रक्रिया का आपने केंद्रीयकरण कर दिया। छत्तीसगढ़ के अंदर जहां पे राज्य सरकार एक एरिया को रेमलू एलिफेंट रिजर्व घोषित कर रही है, आप उसके कोल ब्लॉक को ऑक्शन में डाल रहे हैं। झारखंड सरकार कह रहा है कि कम से कम हमसे तो पूछिए। तो एक संघीय ढांचे पर एक बहुत बड़ा हमला है, तो झारखंड ने भी अपना विरोध दर्ज किया है। देखिए, सबसे बड़ी दिक्कत है जो नितिन भाई ने कहा, मुझे लगता है महत्वपूर्ण है कि इस सारे कोल ब्लॉक के ना एनवायरमेंट के रिलायंस है, ना फॉरेस्ट के रिलायंस है, और लैंड एक्विजिशन के जो सवाल है वो होने वाले हैं। नीलामी आप कर भी देते हैं तो आने वाले समय में ये संकट राज्य सरकारों को ही झेलना है, क्योंकि जो जमीन अधिग्रहण की प्रक्रिया है वो राज्य सरकार का जिला प्रशासन ही संपादित करने वाला है। छत्तीसगढ़ के अंदर आज यदि हम जिन कोल ब्लॉकों के भूमि अधिग्रहण के खिलाफ संघर्ष कर रहे हैं, वो कहीं ना कहीं समुदाय और राज्य सरकार आमने सामने आने वाला है। तो सरकार, केंद्र सरकार तो नीलामी करने के बाद कहीं दूर हट जाएगा, और अंततः ये झगड़े राज्य के अंदर आने वाले हैं, जो राज्य सरकारों के ही के सामने ये संकट बढ़ेगा कहीं ना कहीं। तो निश्चित तौर पे ये विरोध दर्ज होंगे, अभी नहीं है तो बाद में होंगे, लेकिन ये विरोध दर्ज होंगे। हसदेव जैसे लोग अभी से विरोध करने लगे हैं। बहुत सारे इलाके ऐसे हैं कि उड़ीसा के लोगों को शायद उनको पता भी नहीं होगा कि उनके इलाके का कोल ब्लॉक नीलामी की सूची में दर्ज है, और यदि उनको पता चलेगा तो आज नहीं तो कल वो विरोध दर्ज होंगे। लेकिन राज्य सरकारों की चुप्पी पे सवाल है। मध्य प्रदेश से तो खैर हम अपेक्षा नहीं करेंगे कि केंद्र के निर्णय के खिलाफ बीजेपी जाएगा, लेकिन उड़ीसा सरकार को कहीं ना कहीं संघीय ढांचे पे हमले के खिलाफ इस मुद्दे पे बात रखनी चाहिए, ये हमारा उम्मीद है।
Right. We seem to have run out of time on this conversation. I want to thank my panelists for being so generous and for coming out to have this conversation with us. To my audience who are watching right now, environment is something that I feel very strongly about. I believe that as citizens, we have to be more active in reading about the environment, in following stories about the environment. And invariably, we live in big cities, and the environment is something that happens far away, either in the Northeast or in Chattisgarh or in Jharkhand or in Orissa. So we're not really actively involved in it. We need to be more actively involved, because if there's anything this lockdown has taught us, is that if someone messes with the environment in another part of the world, we all have to stay locked in our houses. And this is not something that we should be easily okay with. So be a little more, I mean, we should treat every tree like our tree and every forest like our forest, and be a little more possessive of the environment and the decisions being made around it. Thank you to my panelists for being so kind with your time, and we'll follow up on this story and bring you updates and conversations as the story moves as well. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Thank you.